We are clearly at a major concentration point in the development of the human story. We're in a world crisis. The great challenge, and the thing that didn't exist because I was looking for it passionately, is what's a system-based model of society that can explain the outcomes that we're seeing. I just felt in a calling to try to meet that challenge the best way I could. The idea that the status quo could continue, I just intuitively accepted, like, this is not possible. Some way we're moving towards a new paradigm.
Can you kind of frame out ideas and concepts that you're expressing in the book?
Kind of on pins and needles over here.
I started to accept the idea that there is an aspect of human life that can be mystical, possibly transcend the boundaries of physical form. The other path that got me in that direction, which was the UFO question. And I wasn't just keen to just accept that it's aliens, but I was like, there's something here. The properties that it exhibits violates our general understandings about physics. It pulls you inevitably in the direction of outgrowing materialism because it can't be explained within a materialistic scientific model. And it's interesting, you can go back and look at these very old documents from like Egypt and before, and in this age that's to come, people will fall into materialism. People will live only for wealth. There's like a whole list of things that'll happen that all came true. When you get into the philosophy of it, it's an opportunity for development. So I am optimistic, but I am also realistic in the sense that this is a time where we will likely be confronted with many things that are very challenging. Like, you can never be doom and gloom and a nihilist in the face of terrible things if you have that foundation.
Okay, well, welcome.
Thank you.
Alex Sachon, and I got Adam Shell here, my trusted comrade.
Right.
Yeah. Adam, I love, this is the second time Adam and I have done this, and as long as you're good with it, it won't be the last.
No, I'm good with it.
I love having you on there because we are into a lot of the same things and are curious about the same things. We have such a different way of going about it. Adam's really good at like taking all the information in and then sharing it with people. And I take in the information and I know how I feel about the thing, but when someone asks me, I can't give them all the details. And I always say, if my guy fucking Chef was here, which is Adam is also known as Chef, like he would be able to answer all these questions, but I'm not your guide. You gotta have to do your own research. So there's that.
We can rely upon each other when we're each half prepared for something.
Exactly. So anyway, when we connected, I think in the fall, and then we finally got to schedule this. As I got familiar with work, I reached out to Adam. I go, dude, I'd love to have you on here because I think this is right up his alley.
Great.
I had actually listened to you on Kingsbury because Kyle and I are friends now as well.
Cool.
And I had listened to it months ago, and I'm like, I know that name. And then it's like, oh yeah, great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And so when I was listening to your podcast about the book, what I love that you did was you read the back cover. And I was saying to my buddy Mike, who wrote in with me, I was like, I hope he brings the book because I don't have it. And I would love to just read the back cover to really just land it for people. And then I know we'll kind of get into whatever feels alive. But so much of this stuff for me personally is really fascinating. And again, I know like high level how I feel about these things, but to have someone like you who's done such a deep study in this, I'm really looking forward to getting to allowing my curiosity to lead the way. So yeah, thanks, brother. The name of the book, The Coming World Nation: Why Global Government is Inevitable. And when I was familiar with the title, I was like, oh, that doesn't feel good. The world government, I've been so resistant to that. And it's because there's been a certain way that it has been kind of projected to us. And then in listening to the podcast with Kyle, I was like, okay, it's not what we've been told. So I'm really looking forward to getting into that. So that's the name of the book. Today, our civilization sits on the cusp of two epochal transitions: the shift from nation states to global government, and the shift from capitalism to technocracy. In The Coming World Nation, philosopher Alexander Sachon examines the historical, sociological, and cosmological factors underpinning these twin transformations, focusing in particular on the role that the American empire has played in driving each. He concludes that both trends are inevitable, pulled forward by a synchronistic web of circumstances that cannot be altered. Sachon predicts that accompanying these twin transformations will emerge a third, a profound energy revolution driven by the public revelation of a long classified source of atmospheric energy, the luminiferous ether, which again is right up Alex Zek's alley. He's so into that. He argues that etheric energy was originally discovered over a century ago, but all research into the paradigm has been kept tightly sequestered by a secret scientific institution residing at the apex of the U.S. national security state, the technocratic superstate. As the age of global government and technocracy approaches, this long-concealed energy source is waiting to be revealed, an event that the ongoing UFO disclosure process is foreshadowing. Featuring a unique synthesis of philosophy, science, and history, the coming world nation promises to reshape current debates about the crises and opportunities facing mankind in the present era. This book concludes with a lengthy essay discussing how the world is now entering into a period of cosmic initiation, which promises to bring mankind into a new evolutionary era when the human race will be united under the banner of a new system of global government, the world nation. I mean, there's so much in that, and I'm so stoked about, from the UFO stuff to these black site projects, and again, a lot of the stuff that Adam and I are so curious about. We've done a lot of our own kind of research into it, but really love. I mean, I don't even know where to begin. But
can you? I think. Well, I guess real quickly, what's your evolution? Like, how did you come to this? Because you had a traditional study of sociology and philosophy, as I understand, as a graduate, undergraduate, and graduate degree. So just take us through a little bit your education, and then how you emerged into this more esoteric field of study and philosophy.
Yeah. Well, it started for me in my teenage years. Was when I first gained awareness and became passionate about the idea that we're in a world crisis. So I was learning about, from an early age, the severe environmental problems that we're having. Also, the amount of tremendous suffering that takes place, particularly in like the third world. And so I just felt in a calling to try to meet that challenge the best way I could. And so were you an evangelical Christian growing up with like Revelation and Rapture, and talk about that? No, I never was passionate, or my family was never passionate about like Orthodox, like traditional Western religion. The thing that I got into kind of early on, and I also had an intuitive connection to, was Eastern religions. And when I was in between my end of high school and the beginning of college, I took a month-long trip to China with a group from my high school. One of my teachers. So I had the only mentor I ever had in my life was a teacher from high school. And she was like, basically should have been a college professor, but she had kids and they were going to this it was a private school. They were going there. So she took, or was teaching AP classes, like college level courses. So it was through her and her classes that I started to get introduced to this idea of the world crisis. But also, she also was doing this trip to China. And then before we went, we took a class on ancient Chinese history and art and culture. And I remember I did a presentation on Taoism. And so that's my first exposure to the Tao Te Ching. And that's still my favorite book of like of religious work, because it's really, the theology is cut out entirely. It's like almost a pure philosophy book, but it's like the foundation of Taoism. So that was my introduction into philosophy, and I was interested in that. And then I also had this interest in the dawning realization of a world crisis, and there's a great challenge to be met. And so I had these two interests. So in college, I studied human geography, following up on stuff I was doing in high school. And that's basically, I became interested in trying to look at the big picture of human history and the story of human civilization and its development, because I wanted to frame where we are today within that longer time span. And there was a book, an author who at the time, this is like the early 2000s, named Jared Diamond, who came out with two key works that were very influential to me early on. One was Guns, Germs, and Steel, and one was just called Collapse. And I really like this way of analyzing things and breaking things down into looking at civilization or social systems as systems. And that way you can become very specific about the way you're analyzing things, and it becomes very solution oriented, that kind of analysis. So I did that in undergrad, and then after I got out of school, I wanted to take a couple years before I went to grad school to figure out what I wanted to go to grad school for. But I knew I wanted to keep going on this path. And what I did in school and what I wanted to do in my career, I knew I wanted to have it be oriented towards meeting this challenge. So I got a little bit of experience in the corporate world, consulting world. Didn't love it, but it was my first experience in bureaucracy, working in a bureaucracy. And I had a realization that actually this documentary that came out at the time helped me to come to appreciate. It was called No End in Sight. It was about the Iraq War, but it was like a study of the decision-making culture within the Bush administration that led to so many disastrous outcomes early on in the war. And that made me realize that no matter what your ideals are and whatever kind of solution you want to have on the world, the mechanism to do it, you have to go through organizations. So I realized that I needed to understand more about management and organizations because that was going to be the vehicle of change. So then I went to grad school for a field called organizational science, which is like partly in the business school, but a lot of it's in the social sciences. And it kind of trains you to be a consultant, but you're analyzing organizations as systems, and you're looking at it's just a different way of looking at optimizing kind of like how these things work, how can we improve them. And as I was doing that, it was actually a very dynamic time in that field, because the startup world that was blossoming since the late 90s there was a lot of experimentation in management styles and practices and in approaches to designing organizations. And I got really interested in like post bureaucracy, like what comes after bureaucracy, or how can we evolve this into something better? Because I kind of realized that a lot of the problems that we have come from the inherent shortcomings of that style of organization. Mm-hmm. And so I got really interested in that. And then right as I was getting out of grad school was when Occupy Wall Street was going down. And I hadn't really understood finance. I didn't understand. I mean, we didn't really cover that in school, but that was like front and center. And so I was trying to understand like what happened here, because it was affecting the job market that I was entering into, certainly. But I was living in DC at the time, and this was like popping up everywhere. You know, I'm in the heartland of what's going on. And then that's when I was started to look into that, I found early on somebody who became very influential in my thinking and is cited in the book, The Coming World Nations, is an economist named Michael Hudson. And he's one of the people that violates this idea that nobody saw it coming. He actually wrote an article in Harper's Magazine a few months before the big event, like the Lehman Brothers collapse, talking about there was inevitably going to be a real estate crisis. But he's a historian, and an economic historian, and he goes back and looks at ancient civilizations, which is something I had been interested in, and he connects these patterns in the development of economics and finance over time. And he kind of boils things down to a very simple way of looking at it. And he also made the thing that became very important to me, which is that he connected it, the specific model of financial capitalism that we have that was involved with this crisis, with empire. It's intimately connected with geopolitics. And in the social sciences, when you're trying to develop a model or a theory of society, like how does it work as a system, your data set or your laboratory is the world as it's happening. And so the great challenge, and the thing that didn't exist because I was looking for it passionately, is what's a system-based model of society that can explain the outcomes that we're seeing. And so, and a big problem with it is that the people who in academia aren't dealing with the full data set. There's like taboos against looking at certain things. You just don't do it, you know? And so that's when I decided I wasn't going to go a PhD route. And so I got out of school and I interviewed around for consulting stuff, but I had all these ideas about, on one hand, I wanted to better understand like the financial system and its relationship with empire. On the other hand, like I said, this is a dynamic time of transformation, and we're moving into the possibility of a post-bureaucracy, post-capitalism. So I was interested in those ideas, and I was finding nowhere where I could find a home where I could work on those things. And so I basically made a decision. And at the time, actually, another thing happened, which is I had a son early on when I was in my early 20s. But a lot of things came together, and I ended up basically, to the chagrin of my family, kind of dropping out of the normal career path. And like at night, I started working in restaurants, just barely making it through. But I was doing that, and then my days I could pursue this research. And I was trying to come up with this approach, this narrative, this way of framing the civilization to understand where we are today and what's going on, not only in terms of the financial crisis and economic changes, but like I was saying, I was interested in the world crisis. Like the idea that the status quo could continue, I knew early on. I just intuitively accepted like this is not possible. So some way we're moving towards a new paradigm.
And so in doing that research, like who were kind of most influential in helping you kind of find your way through that?
Yeah. Well, on one hand, it was Michael Hudson, and then later on, Catherine Austin Fitts became a influence. She's speaking at the Confluence.
Yeah,
that's right.
I talked to her a few times early on. There was another geopolitical strategist who is also cite a lot in this book. He became very influential to me. I'm not sure if he's still alive or not, but his name was F. William Engdahl, and he wrote a series of books on the history of the oil industry and the development of the power structures around that, and how those influenced the rise of what I call the American empire. He also wrote another book called Gods of Money, which I really recommend to people. And it's like the history of sort of how our modern financial system came to be, how financial capitalism came to dominate the country. And then, so that was on one hand, the geopolitics side and the sort of analysis of the developing world situation. But then I was also going back and looking at the theory and stuff I had studied in school, and I became very interested in system science. And so I started to research, and that's just also an exciting time for that field. There was a lot of new ideas coming out. But I'm just trying to think. Fritjof Capra, who wrote The Tao of Physics, you guys might be aware of that book, but he wrote a number of books on system science. He became very influential in me. And part of that, part of the field of system science is you're going into the philosophy of science. So you have to go into like the first principles of scientific knowledge. It's something you don't learn in school. They don't really teach you. They just tell you, like as you're going through academia, they just tell you what to believe, basically. Like these are the acceptable ideas. They don't really tell you how to think. So those are my influences early on. And then a certain thing happened. Well, a couple things happened. Number one, I started getting interested at a certain point in figuring out how the mind and consciousness, the kind of deeper questions, like how do I fit those in? Because I started to accept the idea that there is an aspect of human life that can be mystical or spiritual, and that can possibly transcend the boundaries of the physical form. At that point, that was my thinking. So I was like, but I don't see any representation of those ideas in kind of modern formal scientific thinking. So that was one thing, as I was trying to find some way or some influence who would shape my thinking on that, because it was still an open-ended question for me. Later on, I would bring in studies of Carl Jung into the situation. He became a big influence. But I didn't really get into the philosophy or the field of esoteric philosophy. That came a bit later on. But the other path that got me in that direction was when I finally accepted something I had long dismissed, which was the UFO question. Because I'm trying to study politics and all the geopolitics and power structures and stuff like that. And I had just kind of, like most people, compartmentalized that and categorized that away. And then kind of a series of synchronistic things happened where that attitude was basically like I couldn't uphold it anymore. I was like, this is something that is real. I don't know what it is, And I wasn't just keen to just accept that it's aliens, but I was like, there's something here. And that the fact of the UFO on itself, the properties that it exhibits violates the general understandings about physics. So you need something else. And you basically, it pulls you inevitably in the direction of outgrowing materialism or transcending materialism because it can't be explained within a materialistic scientific model. So I started studying kind of mystical philosophies, kind of just at first just reading books that were like surveys of the field. Like these were different thinkers that were influential. And then maybe around like 2013 or 14, I started getting interested in Blavatsky and theosophy, something you mentioned earlier. And that was my introduction to a whole different tradition of human knowledge and thought that is not assimilated into our modern Western thinking. Like her influences were very Eastern, which, like I said earlier, I was intuitively connected with Taoism. And one of the things that brought me to her is that she could talk about Taoism in a way that I understood because I had or like Zen Buddhism, which is another thing I had been interested in. So she was saying things about that I was connecting with, but she was also she was building a whole almost science behind it, behind the metaphysical. And I spent a couple years just researching her and trying to understand what her framework was, like how it all fits together. And she's not a native English speaker, and she was writing in the late 1800s, and it's not easy material. It's like very verbose, and her books are like huge, dense tomes. So it's not that easy to get through, but I was learning it, but I was still struggling with certain things. And then at a certain point, I discovered Manly P. Hall, who was an American philosopher who lived in Los Angeles. He was born in 1901 and died in 1990. And he, like, as I started studying theosophy, his name started popping up, but I didn't look into him. It took me a while because I was just like, I'm just so deep into studying this one figure, Blavatsky. And so at a certain point, I gave him a chance. I read one of his books or maybe listened to a lecture. I can't remember what it was, but it was like from the moment I started listening to him, I was like, this is the person, because he kind of like followed in the footsteps of Blavatsky and was influenced by her early on, but he was also his own person and he has his own unique synthesis and way of teachings, but he made everything so much easier. And so I spent years studying him while I was also doing this other work. And the goal was to make this kind of grand synthesis. So I was doing that up until 2020. I had never written anything. I had tried to write things before, and I would always abandon it because each time I would put it together, I realized where my shortcomings were, like what wasn't working, what wasn't fitting together, what I didn't know yet that I needed to go back. And so I kept going back to the lab. I would write these drafts and then abandon them. And then right around 2020, I felt like I was ready to start. I didn't know exactly how it was going to work, but I was ready to start putting material out and ultimately to write a book. And that's when the lockdowns and stuff happened. And that was actually great for me because as someone who worked in the restaurant industry, when the lockdowns happened, they basically paid you to stay home. So I was able to stay home and just work full time for the first time and not have to do this double life, working at night in this. So I could just do this full time and I could save up and just be living like bare bones lifestyle, like super frugal. But I was able to, since 2020, basically make it work, working on this full time. And that's when I started. It took me a while to find my voice, but that's when I started my podcast and started my Substack. And then it took me a few years, but then I finally wrote a book on Manly Hall, which I'm now doing a revised expanded second edition of, which is not out yet. But I wrote a book on him. And then finally I wrote this book, The Coming World Nation, which is my attempt to synthesis all this material from these like 15 years.
Okay. Can you, so some of the, Cal and I were kind of looking at the same podcast and everything. So I think it'll help us for our listeners. Can you kind of frame out almost like in an architectural fashion the ideas and concepts that you're expressing in the book? Because like, as I understand it, and then correct me, there's the population, you, I, Cal, most of us, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a global order that you refer to as the deep state, or well known as the deep state.
Mm-hmm.
And then behind that, and this is where it ties into the UFOs, there is a secret hand that's controlling everything called the deeper state. that you refer to as a
super
deeper
state,
state. Super state. Okay. So there are these 3 layers. What was interesting and kind of challenging for me in your work is that you basically look at the deep state as malevolent, kind of like we generally do. But the deeper state, the super state, you almost see them as benevolent, like they're keeping us from self-destruction. So just go through that kind of, correct me if where I'm wrong, break your work down from an architectural standpoint, and then like a little description on the 3 layers.
Yeah. In the book, I originally had a kind of the methodology behind it, and I ended up taking it out, and I'm going to put it in this Manly Hall book instead. But the way I think about these different layers is almost like a caste system. But as a philosopher, I think heavily in terms of archetypes. So I think that there's these fundamental patterns in space or in nature, and that the forms that evolve in nature are expressions of these archetypes. So the archetypes can be expressed either positively or negatively. So when I say global government is inevitable, there's a positive and negative expression of the archetype. And the way that most people talk about global government is purely on focusing on the negative expression of the archetype. And I'm with them. There is that negative expression. There is a vast conspiracy of oligarchs and kind of a feudalist mentality that has been pursuing this. But there's other groups, and there has always been, who had other ideas about global government. And I mean, the main idea is if people believe in God as a unifying power, then the idea that the earth should be an interconnected like expression or a kingdom of the divine represents the idea of global government in a way. So that's the to start off with. Is I'm very influenced by the idea of archetypes. But to explain this story, I think it helps to go through the history of it and to start in the beginning. Because then when you that's what I do in the book. The book is laid out. The first part tells the story of the rise of the American empire, and that's focusing on the rise of the deep state. Then in the second half in the middle part of the book, I go back to the beginning that I started analyzing in that first section. I go back to it and I tell this other side of the story that has been playing out in the shadows of this story of the rise of the American empire. And that's the story of this technocratic superstate, which is built around the idea that there were another set of discoveries that while we think in the 19th century, which is the dawn of the modern industrial age, the rise of modern science, that story is told in our textbooks. But there was another paradigm of science that is not materialistic, that is like a breakthrough that was also being discovered during that same time. So there's these 2 pathways. And at a certain point, the breakthrough pathway, which I've always discussed around the idea of the ether, is like the main. And the ether is a very old concept from alchemy. And it's part of this esoteric philosophy that I've been studying for a long time. So I'm comfortable with this idea.
Which can I cut in? Which is, I know, because I'm 18 months older than you or something. I don't know. But I'm 55, and literally in the 70s, it was earth, air, fire, water, ether. Like we were taught that in school.
Wow.
Yeah. And then it just disappeared.
Yeah. Well, that in the 1800s, the ether was that paradigm was the default paradigm in physics.
Even in 1979, it was still the default paradigm.
Well, but it had been written out of the actual like mainstream research community. It began to disappear and be written out in the early 1900s.
Yeah.
But if you go back in the 1800s, like a lot of the breakthrough discoveries, like James Clerk Maxwell and Faraday, certainly Tesla, they were all dealing with this idea of the ether. So all their equations were based on this idea that space, the field of space, that all things exist within, that this was not an empty vacuum, but it was actually a dynamic field that can be interacted with by means of electromagnetism. And so it was only in the early 1900s that there began to be, in my opinion, an organized attempt to basically take that out of public awareness and mainstream attention and to substitute Einsteinian physics, quantum mechanics, these other things that we now know 100 years later never really went anywhere. Well, that was the point. There's been a 2-track system of science that's developed. One of them has to do with the ether and the other one doesn't. So in the second half of the book, I go and try to tell that story as best that we can piece it together. And then in the last half of the book, I try to move things up to date and talk about how ongoing developments, particularly in the second half of the 20th century up to today, kind of illustrate this idea that there was this 2-track system developing, and that that gradually we're seeing a revelation or a disclosure of this etheric energy paradigm, which is intimately related with this UFO mystery, as we'll go into. But if you go back in the 1800s, let's just start with the first part of the book where I'm talking about the rise of the American empire and the emergence of an oligarchy. If you think about 1776, when America declared its independence, we normally think of that it was a victory over the church and the crown, the monarchies. But what hasn't been discussed very much is the idea that in Europe, those weren't the only two power players. There was also a financial, basically aristocratic dynasties, like the Rothschilds, for example. And the emergence of those actually go back to ancient Rome. Like when Rome was actually very much, there was a lot of similarities between the British Empire and then the later American Empire, and the way that Rome was set up, like financially. Well, that was really the beginning of financial capitalism. Like there's different modes of capitalism that you can have, but the particular kind that developed and became dominant is one that is associated very strongly with empire, because the way it works, it basically fuels the rise of a concentrated power structure. And it's also designed to expand and contract. Like expand, then you have during boom time, then during the inevitable downward phase of the cycle, there's a contraction, but the contraction actually centers all the ownership that was developing during that expansion phase within a concentrated group. And that was the way things were developing since the Middle Ages. Like that mode, like the elite, some of the elite families behind the Roman Empire, they seem to have gone north into Venice and Florence and those Venetian states that in like 900, 1000 AD began to kind of reformulate empire, but they did it in a new way because the social environment had changed, the political environment had changed after the fall of Rome. But that particular relationship between finance and empire sort of began to reemerge. And then over the course of the Middle Ages, for the next 600 years, it would gradually move west. It moved to Amsterdam, became another center of power, where those same families, you can see them moving. And then you can track them finally in, I think 1694 was the founding of the Bank of England, which was their institution of basically hegemony over Europe. And that institution basically enthroned an oligarchy with, behind the crown of England, and became the basis of what became the British Empire. So when the American Revolution happened, that financial structure in Europe, and particularly seated in London, the city of London, was still there. And they kept, after the revolution happened, they kept trying to find their way into America. They wanted to create a Bank of England in America, which eventually became the Federal Reserve. So when you go over the history of the 1800s, especially in the beginning, there were many attempts to formulate a central bank, and there would always be a populist uprising against it, because the Constitution didn't necessarily specify how exactly the economics were going to work of the country. It was somewhat of an open-ended question, and there was a debate between some of the founding fathers like Hamilton and Jefferson. So there was a repeated attempts to create a central bank, a privately owned central bank in America after the revolution began. And for about 60, 70 years, that was thwarted. And then a couple of things happened that changed the balance of power. And one of them was the rise of the industrial age. Because what that did is that created a new money aristocracy in America that was somewhat distinct, but in alignment with the old money aristocracy of Europe. The old money aristocracy, their financial pattern was based on agriculture and the traditional economics, slave trade. But that was basically their economics. I go into this in the book, like what their foundation was. But the new industrial aristocracy that was emerging here, these people didn't come from old families. They were kind of like bootstrap type to some degree, but they were ruthless.
Can we put a pin for a second? I just want to digress into a new area of some research that I've been looking into. there seems to be, I'm asking you, I guess, but there seems to be some indication that some of the old money aristocracy of Europe was able to penetrate some of these initial families and provide them funding and create some backdoor allegiances. And also I saw one thing, honestly, if I'm being honest, I saw it's this one scholar I follow on TikTok who was,
I love that you're on TikTok. I'm not even on TikTok. And you can't even use a computer.
I should get on it, but I'm
TikTok
not.
is fucking amazing. It's amazing. And the reason why they hate TikTok is because it's so good and still some truth can emerge, although less and less since it's been taken over. But I don't want to lose the plot here. So also that the opium trade, that a lot of the American industrial families secretly were merchants who carved off a portion and got involved in the kind of India to China, this kind of three-way trade where they were making money in every direction. And that's what they then rolled in to become Carnegies and Rockefellers and other things. So did your research lead, is any of that substantiated by your research about these backdoor deals between
there was an alignment, and it was in the rise of the reason that the central bank was the private central bank model was able to finally move into America was because of alignment between the old money aristocracy and this new money. And JP Morgan is like a central player in this because, you know, his father was located in London and had the connections with the London like aristocrats, those dynasties. And so he was like bringing that and was kind of a player, but then he became this big player on his own right in America and started making moves to consolidate the major industrial concerns. And, you know, that's not the traditional, industrialism is not the expertise of the old money aristocracies. And so, and also America was the place that, you know, the Industrial Revolution was destined to really blossom because we had all the resources and we were also protected by that ocean from all the politics and conniving stuff that was going on in Europe. You know, these great power players, competitions.
How much did the opium trade send the aristocratic old world money, which was largely based on shipping and trade, into the stratosphere? Like from your research, did that just take it to a whole new level?
In my understanding, and this is something it's been a long time since I would have gone into this, but a big part of that was the balance of trade between West and East. And it roped in China and Asia into the British sterling hegemony, basically. And it kept China and Asia as a dependent, basically.
Yeah.
So it's a good example of how the empires began to manifest themselves. It became less and less about, over time, about boots on the ground and dominating just through physical force. And this is something that America would really take to the next level, but it became about kind of soft power. And in a way, that was like a form of that. But as far as like how that money flowed into America, I'm not sure exactly. I just know that there was this mingling of capital between, and it became called the Anglo-American Alliance, basically. But that cooperative attitude or relationship began to change as we go into the 20th century. But the final outcome of this early stage, the 1800s, what things were building towards. I mean, first off, we have the Gilded Age, which very few people talk about now. But the Gilded Age was really when the democratic institutions of America began to be corrupted by this ascendant oligarchy. And if you go back and look at political cartoons from that era, you could apply them to today. It's the same when you go back and just think about Occupy Wall Street, the 99% and the 1%, and all this stuff that was happening at the time. It was 100 years of that, because you go back 100 years earlier and it's the same debate, the same protests that people were having. Yeah. So the Gilded Age was really when the balance of power between the people and the elite shifted. And then once you had there was a number of there were two main crises that were engineered to help really facilitate this. There was one in 1870 and one in 1890. And that paved the way for the Federal Reserve to get founded. And another thing, though, when you go back and you look at the psychology of what the elites wanted at this early time, their ambitions were to consolidate the entire world into the central bank model. But that's why the book that I like called by F. William Engdahl is called The Gods of Money. These people really saw themselves that way.
We're at the time of this broadcast, we're on day 3 of the new Iran war, which is one of the only nations that doesn't have a central bank.
Right. And also, if you go into the Epstein files, right, and you look at the psychology of Epstein, this very elitist mentality, very racist, very it's just a superiority thing like that. And not only with him, but all the people basically, they see themselves as like a caste apart, and they look at everybody else as categorically different from themselves, and less worthy in many ways.
Generally, the goyim, right? Is that what they call
goyim?
I know you're not. Are you technically in it because you're not part of their group, even though you're Jewish?
So I mean, look, I'm Jewish. Was born Jewish. Was bar mitzvahed. My dad's a Holocaust survivor, but. Look, in life, you got the thing that you want to believe, and then you got the thing that appears most truthful. And if you're not aligning with the thing that appears most truthful, then what are you?
Right.
You're just a proxy of mind control and propaganda. So goyslop is the new term that's going on.
Okay.
But my research, which I think I haven't read your books yet, but seems to be consistent, is that there seems to be an ancient order that uses the religion that they kind of draw alignment to. So you have like the Rothschilds drew alignment to Judaism, and they've used Judaism, and they use that for the formation of Israel. And then you have the Bank of England has the Anglican Church, and then they also have the English royalty. The House of Saud has Islam, and then you have also the royals are kind of associated. Then you have like American Anglicanism that's very much associated with Freemasonry. So like Jews just seem to be too fucking good at it, which is like,
they're on another level,
dude. It's so my head is so fucked up over this issue. Like it's a whole other therapeutic podcast to kind of have and everything. But what I never grew up with the secret handshake. I never was exposed to any of the secret handshake or anything like that. I was like
the interest-free loans or anything.
Just the opposite, man. I get fucking low. I started my
You're
business.
balancing it out.
I started my business on those loans, and they were not interest-free. Believe me. So, but there seems to be a secret order or family that has a banking front and a religious front to everything they do, so they can move in this kind of triangulated fashion for hegemony, for dominance. But it very much seems from like my research that the CIA and Mossad were so much behind Epstein's Island and that leverage that maybe at the creation of the Federal Reserve, I would probably say that like the WASPs had their heyday, with the Titanic and killing off of the old families, and now we're in terms of like the Illuminati or the global control mechanisms that kind of undergird everything. It's like it seems to be like the Jewish heyday right now, or the Israeli Mossad heyday right now.
Yeah, it's probably better to say Israeli Mossad because it conflates. For a lot of my Jewish friends, they're so conflicted because it seems that their religion has been co-opted by 100%. That. And they're like, we don't know what to do because we're bad Jews if we don't support them. And yet it doesn't feel right what's going on.
Yeah. Well, where do you live, man? Like I don't live in Israel. I've been there once. You know what I'm saying? Like I live in the United States. So like if there's another nation that's fucking up my nation, fuck that nation. You know what I'm saying? That's my attitude. I'm so far down the rabbit hole that I want to disassociate with the corporate American states. I'm in the process right now of status correction and moving everything. This is a big thing of what our network is into, is moving everything into the private. So I'm moving my family into the private. So I align with Texas right now because this is where I live. and the United States is a corporate fiction that was placed upon me. And then I was given, I was birthed through a birth canal, which is considered, admiralty law, and into charted U.S. waters. And so the placenta was owned by the federal government. I was given an all caps name, which is a straw man fictive. So I don't want any part of that kind of beast system, which I think your work really illuminates. So I'm trying to extricate myself from all of it. But just like answer the question about being an American Jew, like I'm a fucking Texan. I live here. Yeah. My children go to school here. They play sports here. So if some other nation, I don't care what the affiliation is ancestrally or anything like that. Like if they're fucking up my nation, fuck them.
Yeah. Well, let's get back to this. I have a take on this, but let's see. This is like now moving to the second half of the 20th century. But we'll get there. Yeah. Because I want to go back, and now we're up to the Federal Reserve, right? The founding of the Federal Reserve. Which there were Jewish interests in that, but in the book I focus mostly on the Rockefellers, which were not Jewish. And the Rockefellers for me are the preeminent family dynasty in America behind the rise of the American empire, and they have their hands in almost every aspect of life. They shaped the medical system, they shaped the rise of industry, they shaped the oil age.
Yeah, Flexner Report changed everything,
and they had a very intimate relationship from the very beginning with the rise of the military-industrial complex, because going up to World War I, oil was a marginal product. It was a marginal use. It was mostly used for lighting. Mm-hmm. And then once the Edison/Tesla, because really Tesla is responsible for the electrical system we have. Tesla invented the light bulbs, but Edison invented the light bulbs, but Tesla's AC system, alternating current system, is the foundation of our electrical grid and made the whole industrial age possible. So once that hit, and around the turn of the century, oil was not even really needed for lighting anymore. And the Rockefellers at that point had carved out a monopoly for this oil trade, but it was declining. And so they moved parallel and found a new use for it, and it became the engine, the combustion engine. And in the process of doing that, there was a lot of alternatives that had to be stamped out. But basically, during World War I, World War I is very critical for the rise of oil, because oil became a critical component of warfare, because all the modern militaries needed to have these engines and vehicles and planes that ran on petroleum. So there was a very tight relationship between the Rockefeller dynasty and the rise of the military-industrial complex in America. And that, the whole war, actually, you can go back, and I talk a lot about the World War I in the book, because it was, and then the section I have on it is called World War I, A Conspiracy of Interests. It was completely a planned war. And it really marks the turning point. Different people had different interests in it, but the British were basically facilitated it as a means to forestall the inevitable economic decline of their empire. And once it became clear that oil was going to be critical to power projection in the 20th century, then access to oil became key. In the Middle East, now we're going to be entering the foundations of the founding of Israel, but the Middle East became critical. And in my opinion, that is, the Rothschilds clearly were the godfathers of the Israeli project, you could say, in terms of making it happen, putting their capital, putting their relationships to it.
Can you just explain for people who don't understand how Israel came to be through, I believe they loaned money to, was the British Empire?
The British Empire basically, again, the Rothschilds were like the preeminent financial dynasty behind the British Empire, and were one of the most powerful families in the world. They're Jewish, obviously, but they, it began with an agreement between the British Crown and this family to set this land aside, which was, obviously already occupied by people, but to set it aside for a future use by the Jewish people, I guess, the future Jewish state. But this is also a time when now control over the politics of the Middle East became paramount, because you could not have the people in the Middle East nationalize the oil for themselves. because then they would become a power in their own right, and they would have a huge amount of influence over the destiny of your empire, you know? So that's when these outside manipulations began to take place. And the whole map of the Middle East that we know today was put into motion, which is a very unnatural map when you look at actual like tribal and racial allegiances in the area. It was almost carved up to create conflict because they needed to balkanize it in order to basically divide and conquer and to keep that resource. And then America quickly took control of that project from the British. And because after World War I was the end of the British Empire. They started to try to forestall their decline, but this is when kind of the rupture happened to some degree in America between the Anglo-American alliance, the English and the American aristocracy. Because figures like Rockefeller and JP Morgan, they weren't happy to just participate in the continuance of the British Empire. They didn't want to share that power. They saw the time now is for America. And they basically didn't ostracize the European and British capital, but they gave it an outlet, but they were like, we're now directing the show. It's going to be our show. So that the Rockefellers and JP Morgan became the new scions of an ascendant American empire. And they now had their institution to do it within, which is the Federal Reserve. And they owned and were consolidating a giant industrial cartel system, which would be the backbone of the military industrial complex. Yeah. So this was all in the early 1900s. Yeah. World War I was the catalyst.
Yeah. And then they took over farming with the introduction of fertilizers and pesticides.
Medical system.
And then the medical system with the Flexner Report, moving us away from like kind of natural homeopathic kind of combination of allopathic and natural medicines to a completely Western allopathic pharmaceutical model based on petrochemicals, created the concept of quackery, destroyed midwifery and home birthing, and then the educational system. I mean, it was...
Yeah. How did they basically turn petroleum into these pharmaceutical products? Like, what was the kind of birth of that whole thing?
They already had that relationship between the military and the petroleum was the first thing. And then they basically did a number of things. One, that they started to make this combustion engine petroleum model the backbone of the economy. That really started heavily, that move in around the 40s. But even before then, this was the plan is to make petroleum the centerpiece of the American economy, because that would facilitate the rise of the military industrial complex, which was also centered around petroleum. And the demand that it created not only enriched and made the Rockefellers more powerful, but it also gave them more resources to move into these other territories and to do the work that they needed to do to consolidate and keep their monopoly control over the industry, the shipping, the refineries, all of that. So they were looking for adjacent markets to move into. And so they were the ones that had all the money. So they funded the universities, they funded the research, and they pushed out anything that was a competitor to it. They owned the media, they owned the politicians. So that was basically the state of play. It was an oligarchy. So now we have two parallel stories here. We have the normal story of the American nation state, and then we have the rise of this oligarchy, which really, especially with the rise of the Federal Reserve, we no longer really have the democratic republic of the founding fathers. It wasn't designed to have this enthroned aristocracy or this private central bank. So America as a democratic nation really ceased to be at 100 plus years ago. And so that's and then finishing with World War I and World War II are very connected, because this American oligarchy now inherited the project for a global imperium that the British had their sights set on. And the American aristocracy now were the ones who were going to inherit the project to create a global central banking system that they would be enthroned in as the gods of money. And so there were a number of very important things that happened in between World War I and World War II that set the stage for World War II to happen. And World War II was like engineered 20 years in advance.
Yeah.
And one of the very important things about it is that there was a move by the American industrialists who had already consolidated a cartel system in America to create a global cartel system. And this is a side of the story that most people don't know, but the Americans and the American corporations and banks were extremely involved in the rise of Nazi Germany and the reindustrialization of Germany after World War I. And also the whole loan program that caused a crisis in Germany. They were behind that almost with the purpose of facilitating what would become another military power to have another world war, in which America, after the war, would formally be enthroned as the global empire.
Before we go too deep into World War II, because this is something that Cal and I have talked about, we've the YouTube channel My Lunch Break or My Lunch Hour, where they look at ancient buildings and the possibility of a mud flood, and like they go to Chicago and they look at all the buildings of Chicago and how could this have been built in 1894 with without machine tools,
and all the World's Fairs,
and so forth. So I don't know whether you've done. There's a lot of things running in parallel, but I'd love to get your, if any of your scholarship has kind of gone into this subject. But it seems that World War I to World War II was part of a reset and changed us into this new paradigm of this kind of global American oriented empire and oligarchy. But and then some of the things that you talk about with the airships and so forth. So did your research kind of lead you into any of the areas of like this notion of like a really orchestrated reset, Tartarian empires, like mud flood, the cracking of the bells, like everything kind of shifting. The conspiratorial term region.
I'm aware of it. I'm honestly not that knowledgeable of it because it doesn't. All the primary people that I kind of built my framework through don't talk about it, and their framework of history is, I guess a Tartarian person would say it's conventional or orthodox, but I think the questions are valid about the architecture and stuff. I think we have to also look at another great mystery is what role secret societies, masonry, stuff like that played. And that's something I do know a lot about because Manly Hall is like the preeminent philosopher of that. One thing I'm inherently distrustful about is this idea seems to be a creation of the internet age. And so, what the implications of that, I don't know are, but the only time I've ever heard of it is from these YouTube documentaries and stuff like that. But not to dismiss it because I would like to know more about the theory, but I never came across it other than stumbling on the internet.
Yeah, this is exactly why I'm asking you the question. Like, did your research find that it was between World War I and World War II, like an orchestrated reset, that there was some aspect of civilization, free energy, things like that existed before, and then beginning with World War I and culminating with the end of World War II, this complete reset happened?
In terms of rewriting history and such?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would be shocked if that was true because that's a tall order to rewrite history when we have books from 1,000 years ago.
Well, I mean, just look over the course of my lifetime, the ether disappeared. I mean, in 45 years of education, in kindergarten, we were taught earth, fire, air, water, ether. And now my kids don't know what ether is.
Right.
So
yeah, it's possible. People have known about quote unquote free energy or the ether for thousands of years.
Yeah.
So the idea that people were engineering, in a way, all the old temples, the sacred architecture, if you guys ever looked at books of like the Chartres Cathedral or any of the great like medieval cathedrals, the architecture is all sacred geometry. It's like the most profound. Things that you could, it's literally unbelievable. But for me, with this background of like esotericism, I understand where that comes from. I understand the dissemination of those ideas going back to classical civilization, Greece and Rome.
Like, was scaffolding that good 1,000 years ago that they could make, Notre Dame?
Well, and they also talk about one of the theories is like these weren't meant for they weren't religious cathedrals. They were power stations and sacred geometry, and they just got co-opted as, now these are just our places of worship.
No, I think that they're both, but I think the economic thing, the idea that they're purely power generation is definitely a mistake because these are these are temples of the old, what I consider like the one true religion, which is the religion as the experience of a transcendent. And so think about like the Great Pyramid or any other, even you could go way back. Like these things also have the same principles that the medieval architecture has in terms of the sacred geometry woven into it. And they are designed, what I do agree with those researchers is they are designed to tap into these energies, but that's part of these were used for initiation ceremonies.
Mhm.
These were temples of initiation of the mystery, of an institution called the mystery schools, which we haven't talked about yet. But so that's my take on them. These are part of the survival and dissemination of a very old priesthood.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was driving, because I've heard you talk about Atlantis and some of your others. So I guess if I can concisely put in a question, so we can kind of really delve into your scholarship. Potentially surviving Atlantean infrastructure, which could be these buildings, so much of like Chicago and so much of Grand Europe, and then leading to World War. So there were some vestiges that then maybe became Tartarian, and then the way they had their society organized and the way that the kind of growing oligarchy was happening, like specific orchestrated resets between World War I to World War II. That's kind of what I was saying. Is there any pattern through your research that almost goes from Atlantis to surviving infrastructure and concepts that then hit the hard reset beginning with World War I?
Yeah. There are, because for me the great question is, you see these things, this kind of architecture and the lineage of masonry was very influential, particularly in the 1900s. I mean, it was basically the American Revolution was a Masonic project. We can go into that as a separate thing, because I almost feel like the esoteric thing maybe we should go through this whole imperial kind of thing and then go back and go to esoteric, because
because I appreciate some of this would be great, like offline, just us fucking curious, and people don't need to hear us speculating. But yeah, I'd love that, and I'm kind of on pins and needles over here. Like, what happened from World War I to World War II?
Well, one of the things that's fascinating is that there seems to be, around the turn of the century, 1900s, is that all this stuff disappears. But in my theory, it gets absorbed into this institution that I call a technocratic superstate. So we'll get to that story in a minute.
Oh yeah, because we haven't even talked about that.
So we still got to build the kind of deep state and the rise of the conventional American empire as we think of it. So World War II. So there was an attempt after World War I, not even just an attempt, but successfully what happened is that the American cartel system began to, GE, for example, began to expand globally and moved into Germany and Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been a very strong influence of these kind of back channel American interests in Nazi Germany, who was our adversary, and then later during the Cold War of Soviet Russia, that industrially they were both dependencies on America. And there is this research that people haven't been able to make sense of, which is like why were companies like IBM and the Rockefellers, like their Standard Oil was involved with the Nazis right up until the break of the war, and in some cases maybe even after, because they were, this was part of a super large grand strategy, an ambitious grand strategy to create a global imperium and to enthrone this global central banking kind of monopoly over the whole world. Like that is a real plan. You can go back and hear them kind of discuss it. And I have some quotes in the book from speeches and stuff that some of the leading figures were giving. It's very feudalistic. It's basically just a forward projection of feudalism. Like medieval feudalism didn't just disappear when we had the rise of the nation states. It took this new form. But that kind of mentality of like seeing yourselves as categorically different from like the lesser humans survived. And then in the modern age, you see that kind of mentality with people like Bill Gates. His father was a eugenicist. He's clearly a eugenicist with some of the stuff that you see now coming out with the Epstein files. Epstein was a eugenicist. Like, these are people who see themselves as categorically different than the rest. But that mentality is old mentality. It's just expressing itself in a new form. And then, but World War II becomes this kind of central story in my book, because World War II for me is like the big pivot point before and after. After World War II is the formal rise of the American empire. Like it was everything else before this was it maneuvering its assets into place. But you still had these geopolitical rivals who had to be dealt with, Germany and Britain particularly. And World War One, and then you can kind of the Americans talk like this. They're like, well, they'll bleed each other dry during the war. We'll do everything we can to keep the war going because America was supplying almost all sides of the war, and that World War One and World War Two gave the money, resources, and catalysts to build out this tremendous military-industrial complex, which after World War II was kept in place and grown even further through the guise of the Cold War, which is a completely engineered, conflict. So World War II becomes very important. Now, there's an aspect of World War II that almost nobody talks about or has known about, and there's only like a few people I've been able to turn to put this together. But that's a story about what happened in Nazi Germany and the kind of inner mysteries of the Nazi Party. Because when we think about Germany, we always think about the Nazis, but the Nazi Party was actually only the outer form. Inwardly, it had its own equivalent of a deep state, which was called the SS. And the SS had basically rejected British and American the worldview that began to emerge. So we're having this part I'm going to talk about will make more sense once we go back and talk about the airships and the rise of the technocratic superstate. But basically, by World War II, we had already seen in America the disappearance of the science of the ether and any technologies that would reference it. It became completely conventional in terms of the mainstream military-industrial complex of America. And its hegemony was built on missiles and planes and bombs and stuff like that. Not these like kind of weapons that Tesla was talking about in the, right around the turn of the century. So it had those ideas had disappeared in America already, and what I'll argue is that were basically an institution emerged to monopolize that whole entire paradigm of thought, scientifically and technologically. So that became a governance entity, but it remained in the shadows not only of the general public, but it was in the shadows also of this emerging oligarchy. Because if you look at the worldview of people like the Rockefellers, they're entrenched in materialism, and their ambitions is all materialistic. Whereas the ether paradigm is a totally different way of looking at things. And the focus of attention moves from forms in space to space itself, the idea of a dynamic energy field and how you interact with that. So it's like a shattering, it's like a 180 degree shift, but you don't see any intimations of that in what we normally consider the ruling elite of America, which is why I hypothesize that there's something in the shadows of that. But in World War II in Nazi Germany with this SS group, they had abandoned rejected the kind of mainstream scientific ideas and belief systems of the West, both in scientifically, but also in terms of the religion. And they became very interested in formulating their own sort of custom Germanic Teutonic mythology for themselves. And it's interesting, so they were probing a lot of occult esoteric literature, but not staying true to it, but basically taking it and using it for their own purposes. So, for example, the whole idea of the Aryan race, which is always associated with the Nazis, and their like white kind of ideology. The term Aryan is actually a very old Hindu term. It's like 10,000 years old, and it has nothing to do with that idea at all. But and it's actually a word and a concept I deal with a lot in my work. I mean, the idea of the Aryan concept of a root race is what it's called in esotericism. There's literally nothing to do with the German concept. But this is just an example how the Germans were probing these ideas, these unorthodox ideas, and also looking into old European history, like pre-Christian, trying to find and formulate their own kind of backstory. And they started taking stuff and misappropriating it. But they started getting into alchemy and the ether, and were investing serious resources in researching this. Now, I posit, and this again, we'll go back and go to the whole story of this, but I posit that this was already this kind of research had already been taking place in America for 100 years, back into the 1850s. At least we can track it. And certainly there were secret societies and esoteric orders that would have been aware of this, for a long time, dating back to the Middle Ages and classical civilization. Because, like we're saying, it's a part of alchemy, and alchemy is one of the fundamental sciences of esotericism, esoteric philosophy. But the Nazi SS were experimenting with this stuff on their own right and kind of going rogue in a way. And I say going rogue because the whole rise of the Nazi Party and many of their ideologies came from the Americans, that the Rockefellers and such. They were the ones who brought the eugenics philosophy to Germany. They were the ones who were funding many of the researchers in Germany who we later associate with the atrocities of everything that happened. So there is evidence that the Germans were, particularly this group, the SS, had begun to develop a super top secret research program in parallel with some of the other advanced research that they were doing that we know about. Because they were actually, by the end of the war, they were, even in stuff like fighter jets, had eclipsed what the West had, what the Allies were able to put together. Technologically, they were doing very well, and essentially they ran out of time. If the war had gone on 6 months further, we may be talking about a different story of history. But the SS were experimenting with the ether, but they were explicitly trying to weaponize it. And as the war went on, and it became clear that the Nazi leadership that was prosecuting that war, like Hitler and his whole posse around him, that they were not going to win the war, then the SS, which was not run by Hitler but by a guy named Heinrich Himmler, and he had his own kind of power structure, they kind of secretly took over the war effort. So by the very end of the war, they were moving at putting all their resources into the development of these weapons. And the institution that they founded to serve as the home of this research project, it was called the Kammlerstab, and it was run by a guy named Hans Kammler. He was an engineer. And he played two roles. He had an outer role and an inner role. His outer role is actually, he was the one who designed the concentration camps. But the growth that you can track this, the growth of the concentration camps were aligned with these underground facilities. So actually, to the degree that we talk about underground black sites and stuff that exist today, really that model seems to have been pioneered in Nazi Germany, because they had built these very elaborate multi-tiered underground bases that they were performing this research in, to this exotic paradigm of physics. They were desperately trying to weaponize it because they thought this was the only way they could win the war. So they were throwing all their resources towards all kinds of exotic weapons. But I think they essentially wanted to produce something like what Tesla called a death ray or something like that. But basically, whether it was a bomb or a ray or an advanced fighter jet, they were just using any means. And there's also evidence to suggest that they were beginning to research in the realm. They were developing early prototypes of what we would consider today flying saucers. And I talk about that in the book. And so at the end of the war, that whole thing collapsed very quickly. When it came to the end of the war, they ran out of money, they ran out of resources, the Americans were invading. And the Americans definitely had some level of knowledge that this was existing, because right as soon as the war ended, they had this kind of it's not written in mainstream history books, but they had a tremendous amount of resources move into these areas. They were in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and then Southeast Germany was the main hub of this activity. And there was a whole underground infrastructure that was built, that the Americans moved in and basically took all the research, took all the top scientists, brought them over to America under the guise of this paperclip program. But there were other programs too, but basically harvested that whole thing. And then according to my theory, they replicated it back home. So after World War II, we find not only the rise of the American empire in the conventional sense, with the story that we've been talking about these oligarchies and their ambitions, but now this German model of secret science and the whole apparatus and institutional apparatus involved with protecting it, concealing it. There's a lot of information warfare aspects to it that the Nazis had perfected, or were at least putting together, that the Americans would come to end up adopting after the war. So all of that stuff was going on. That's sort of the secrets history of World War II. And so basically the concentration camps were used as these slave labor camps, and it was absolutely brutal conditions. They would just treat these people like they were nothing, disposable. They would work them to death essentially, and then bring the next people in. But they were building these underground facilities, and they still exist in Germany. And only recently there's been some interesting like documentary footage where you can kind of get a glimpse of it. But this is that's the basis of what I think throughout the Cold War ended up becoming built out to a big degree. And this all factors heavily into the history of the UFO program. So this stuff goes back a long way. So World War II is this very important central piece in the story. There's sort of a before and after. Like before, everything was building up to this point, and then afterwards, this is how I posit that there's the normal history of the nation state. Then there's this empire, this imperium with the oligarchy, and then there's this other thing that was, at least after World War II, we know it was harvested and recreated, that was categorically separate than the conventional military-industrial complex, but it's concealed within it. And this became the off-the-book stuff, the super deep black projects. Now, the great mystery is that when American forces harvested this program, and remember, some of the most elite oligarchs in America were involved with facilitating the rise of the Nazi Party in the first place. So how much awareness and how integral certain like very deep players in America were of what was going on in Germany, I think they had to, on some degree, there had to be some knowledge of it. I just don't think it was at the level of the Rockefellers and the JP Morgans. Because again, if you listen to what they say, they're materialists. They don't seem to have any ambitions or knowledge about this different paradigm. But now let's go back and look at the story of the technocratic superstate, because this goes back into the 1800s. And that story begins with the rise of the airship mystery. Is this something that you've stumbled on?
Oh yeah.
For me, like this was the big breakthrough on the whole story of the UFO program, because there's these newspaper sightings and these reports from 1870s, 1880s.
Hold on, I need to make a distinction in my mind. So the airships that you're talking about, are these also the Zeppelins that were like commonly?
No, these are different.
So this, because I'm down with this whole thing, like these etheric energy towers that were like the Empire State Building, and that there seems to be, they would often connect to these airships at the time. So these airships, turn of the century, early 20th century airships, the Zeppelins, that's different than the airships you're talking about.
Maybe. I mean, the Zeppelin, I don't know, maybe they are the same. I never thought of it in terms of the word Zeppelin. I always just called them airships.
Yeah.
And then the material was always called airships. But I mean, Zeppelin could also be the kind of, was it the Heisenberg or whatever?
Yeah,
or
Hindenburg disaster, which seems to be another psyop that was purposely done to like kill that model.
It could be, yeah. But the airships, so there's this literature that go in the 1800s. There were literally hundreds of newspaper reports, and it was very prominent in the 1890s, but you get reference to them going back to the 1850s, in which there was clearly experimentation being done in America into this paradigm of etheric energy. So this is before even the Wright brothers. This is why the Industrial Revolution and the sort of the development of conventional science and physics, engineering, was still in development. There was also the rise of this completely alternate paradigm of science that was developing. And we know that it was developing because there were these accounts, these technologically advancements have been made, because there are these sightings of these airships that in many ways have certain properties that we now associate with UFOs. They weren't necessarily moving into and out of like visible formation. That breakthrough, I think, came later. But they were able to levitate. They were able to move like at the speed of a bullet, basically. But the thing is, they were shaped like ships. Like the technology that these like reports account, it was of the time period. It was almost like these steampunk looking vessels that people would describe. But at this point, it's clearly human that's behind this research. It's clearly some secret society type of thing that's getting into it. And it may be more than one, because I think there's evidence to suggest that more than one group was working with this kind of model. or experimenting with this. But there are also accounts of these ships landing and then the people coming out and like either trading with people for supplies or making conversation with people. So this is a human activity, but yet we're seeing the properties that we now associate with aliens, which is like levitation and faster than sound barrier travel. It seems like at this early point, the science and the models were working with this idea of telluric currents, which it interfaces with this idea of the ether. But the main idea here is that the Earth, there's an electromagnetic grid that has these kind of hot spots in it, and there's connective lines. And if you look at the sites of ancient temples, they are heavily interfacing with this idea that there are these hot spots on the Earth, like electromagnetic, energetic hot spots. And so, yeah, a lot of temples are located on them, but they also have these patterns of connection. And I think these ships were riding these certain like longitudinal, latitudinal lines that were known to be these currents of energy.
They were something outside of the nation states at that time. So like, were these airships American airships, or were they coming in from other lands, other dimensions?
America became the homeland of the research because this is like, there was a huge amount of land to experiment with those. So the American West in particular was where all these sightings weren't happening on the East Coast where all the population was. They were happening out in the American West. And the one entry point that we have into it, like an insider's look at what these societies were like, comes from, God, if I can remember his name, I talk about him in the book. At the name, his name is going to escape me for a moment, but a journal of his was found in the 20th century. It was a journal that was made in the 1800s by a guy who was part of one of these societies. And he tells the backstory about the particular society he works with, and he says that there were others like him. That he just references the idea that there were other societies that were working on this project. But he says that the particular club that he was involved with was called the Sonora Aero Club, and this was based out of Sonora, California, which is rural. And there was the founder of it was this engineer. You think he was a mining engineer originally, but he was researching and doing experiments into alchemy and had made some discovery that allowed for anti-gravity properties. And so he started to work with this and try to develop a technology. His ambition was to create like a commercial application of this. But he formulated a sort of society of engineers around him, and they were working to develop this technology. And then at a certain point, they ran out of funds, and he gets connected with this is what the guy says in this journal, actually a German group. It's called NIMSA. That's the only reference he has. It's just an acronym. But it was called NIMSA, and they came in and provided some financing. And then this is back when Germany was Prussia still. And they sent a kind of emissary out there, and he was like, oh, we're going to weaponize this for our own ambitions. This is back when they were still trying to unify the German states. They wanted to weaponize it, and the founder of the Sonora Aero Club refused, and then he dies in a mysterious accident not long after. But so I think that whole story went down in somewhere between the 1850s and 1870s. So the mainstream breakout of these airship sightings was in the 1890s, particularly the years 1896 and 1897. And that's when you see literally hundreds of reports of all different types of these airships. So it seems like there were several societies working on them, and then they all kind of collectively hit the breakthrough where they could actually develop these functioning models. So many of not only the sightings, but the incidents where people with these airships would land and people would like talk to the pilots and stuff like that. Some of the references are like, these people were like, yeah, we were trying to develop a commercial application of this. But then in 1897, this technology just disappears all of a sudden. All these sightings, it's like overnight it disappears. And for me, that tells me this thing was consolidated. Something happened where all this work was now consolidated. And then right around the same period is when you start to see the disappearance of the ether from the textbooks. So that's when I posit that the technocratic superstate, which is what I call this institution that emerged, which probably would have started small almost like a secret society or something like that. I don't know what interests were behind it, but this is I posit that this is when that emerged. Now, this is also the time period of Tesla, and Tesla was working with a lot of these same ideas and had designs for these type of vehicles. But Tesla, in my reading of it, was much more of like a prodigy, or kind of a rogue lone inventor. And he doesn't seem to have been a part of this other current. So he was developing ideas. I'm not sure how much he knew, if any, that other people were working with the same ideas that he was. But his saga, he interfaces at a certain point with JP Morgan. And JP Morgan initially was financing a project of Tesla's. Tesla sold it to him kind of with a different idea than what Tesla intended for it, a different intention. Tesla originally sold him on the idea of developing like a early version of like transatlantic telephone communication. And then, but the project kept going over budget, and he kept asking for more and more money. And eventually he, fessed up to JP Morgan. JP Morgan's like the preeminent oligarch in the world right now. He's basically the central, before the founding of the Federal Reserve, JP Morgan was like the one-man central bank. And very much an imperialist as well. So JP Morgan ends up shutting down Tesla's work, and then basically a conspiracy of things happens where Tesla is basically outcast. None of his work is ever financed again, and he dies broke, in the 30s. But I think even before Tesla, people were working with these ideas, and an institution had been founded to basically monopolize this paradigm and to be the custodian of it. So whether I see that as innately beneficial or benevolent or not, I think that that's what happened, and I try to recreate what the psychology would have been of a group that would have done that. Now we know that technology was not ever applied. Even the airship technology, as it was in the 1890s, was never applied to warfare in the 20th century. So we know it was kept categorically apart from everything else that was taking place. We know that the oligarchs and the power structures behind the rise of the American empire don't seem to have any awareness of this. So that's why I posit that it was something that emerged in the shadows or in secrecy. Now, we also were discussing earlier, like what happened to Masonry? Why did that disappear? Why did the power, like the ideas that they were the custodian of the old age, if you could pick one group that had, that you could say would have been the inheritor of the ideas of ancient civilizations and which could be responsible for building the kinds of stuff that you're talking about, that a lot of the Tartarian people talk about these, advanced architectural designs and things like that, it would be the Masons. But in the 20th century, the Masons become more of a political entity, and the scientific ideas behind it seem to, it's like, where did it go? And my feeling is that the esoteric aspect of Masonry must have been involved in this. Also because Masonry is this esoteric, it has the entry point into esotericism and alchemy and things like that. So it would have had the know-how to be involved in this whole airship mystery. I can't like formally connect it. Although the only thing I can say, the connection between Masonry and these airship societies is the fact that some of the reports from the 1890s talk about or give names for some of the people that they meet. And there's this name Hiram that comes about a lot, Hiram. And Hiram is part of the lore. The name Hiram is part of the lore of Masonry. It's part of their own mythology, the figure named Hiram of Beef. So that's my only, but I just could, intuition and also just logical reasoning, I feel like the Masons must have been, not the outer body of Masonry, but whatever, like the inner custodians of sacred architecture and sacred geometry and ancient knowledge would have moved into this space. And I think that that's where the spirit of Masonry went into this institution. Mm-hmm. I call it the technocratic superstate. But so I try to recreate the psychology of what their ideas would have been, or what their, and I think the one thing is that being aware of what the powers and potentials of this, but also the dangers of the weaponization of it, is that this could never be weaponized or used offensively, because it has the power to not only, dominate other people, but you could literally destroy the earth. If you set up amplifying waves in the earth field, magnetic field, like you could rupture, you could destroy the whole thing, you know? So the kind of power we're talking about here is immense. And it's also like to wield that power, you don't need to have the type of facilities that we think of like with atomic weaponry, the nuclear bombs, where only a small number of players can really play in that game. You need a whole state apparatus to support it. Like this is something that with the right amount of knowledge and just a relatively small lab, you can make big effects.
Would this be like the directed energy weapons and stuff like that? Yeah.
And Tesla was talking, I quote some articles of Tesla in the 1930s talking about this stuff, like what it could be used for. And it gives you, it's like godlike power. You know, it's the kind of power that in the myths of old Atlantis, like Plato was describing, is that there were these priest magicians that had basically become enthroned at the height of American Atlantean civilization, and they brought the golden age originally, but then there was this sort of decline, this move into materialism psychologically and egotism. Those propensities weren't developed in the Atlantean consciousness or psyche, but as they started to emerge, then that priesthood ended up becoming like sorcery in a way. So they're dealing with the same etheric field, but they're engaging with it in a different way that today we engage with it scientifically and mechanically or mystically at a very high level. But them, it was like ceremonial magic, and that was like the heyday of these kind of things. And that kind of thing carried on to some degree through the Middle Ages and even up to today. I mean, it's possible that, but so we're talking about Masonry. Yeah, my feeling is that they were somewhere how involved in the founding of this institution, and their ideals would be this paradigm can never be weaponized, but it also, like, in order to properly harness it and have an economy or world system that is actually able to both use this energy resource, but also to protect against its misuse, you had to have a global government. You had to have basically the kind of thing that we're moving to today, which is technocracy. That's one of the main parts of the book, because I think the origin of technocracy is not the conventional origin that a lot of researchers today look at it as this innately benevolent thing. But I think the origin of it is that it's fundamentally, this either paradigm is fundamentally incompatible with capitalism and that model of economic development. So you need a science and energy-based and technology-based form of economic organization. And the main thing about technocracy is that it's not based around money; it's based around energy. So it's a way of organizing society and economic life through energy. But to do that, you need to be able to measure the various inputs and outputs of energy at every level of society. And I think that that's the true intention behind the build out of what Catherine Austin Fitts calls the control grid, because that same infrastructure you could use for absolute control over people. But I think that's the negative expression of this archetype. The positive one is the idea that to ever have an etheric energy based economy or society, you have to have this infrastructure put in place. So going back to the thesis of the book, when you read the back cover, we're moving towards from nation states to global government. Well, that's been a whole process that's been 150 years or even longer in the making. But through much of the 20th century, you see the rise of we had the nation states consolidated, around the end of the last century or the 1800s, and then once the nation states were set in place, then you have these kind of transnational bodies emerge. The banking institutions were an early one. And then you have like things like the EU, then you have trade organizations and NATO, so these are all linking things that are building larger and larger blocks of interconnection. They're done under the guise of empire, but at the same time, that's just been the sort of dharma of our age, or that's like, things are, that's how they played out. But I think the infrastructure that's set in place, you could get rid of the empire part eventually, but you could keep that infrastructure, and that could become the basis of a globally interconnected society. So we're moving from nation states to global government. We're moving from capitalism to technocracy, and this whole backstory of the either, I think, is the real story with that. And then
so basically, what you're saying is that there's two things that are simultaneously happening. So the whole oligarchy, domination, and reconfiguration to one world governments is based on the suppression of this ether technology. And then on top of that, there's a super state element that just feels humanity. If the deep state element got it, it would be used immediately for like control and no good.
Yeah.
Do you have any sense on who this deeper state is? Like, what's your...
Well,
is it an energetic field? Is it something that becomes like spiritual, or
what, the institution?
yeah, like, well, I mean, we seem to know what the deep state is. It's things that you just, World Economic Forum,
Yeah.
UN, the EU. I mean, obvious institutions and organizations that are moving towards this technocracy,
Mhm.
global governance, surveillance state, digital currency, social credit stores, control.
Mhm.
Mechanisms of oppressive totalitarian control, which seem to be happening. Some of them, I think, are further along than the United States. Certainly, England has made some terribly big strides recently. But you're suggesting that there's something above that that is
Mhm.
controlling, like the all-powerful ether technology that could liberate the world or destroy the world.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, in my theory, so this now we're going to open up the door into the esoteric aspect, which we didn't, there's a whole history associated with that we should go into. But my feeling is that this technocratic super state institution is the governance body, but it's very compartment, like the characteristic of the military industrial complex, which is it's seated within that, and it gives that the military industrial complex gives it the resources and the cover to do its work. I also think it's intimately involved with this UFO mystery, right?
Yeah.
So I don't think the UFOs are alien. I think it's part of the mysteries of our own, existence here on Earth, and our own sort of hidden, concealed.
Do you
history.
ascribe to interdimensionality movement, or do you ascribe to that there could be that we live under a firmament and there could be parallel worlds happening in other areas, like outside the ice wall, or like what's your cosmological view?
Yeah,
Because that'll help us understand of where this power structure, this superstate power structure, might come from. Is it something that's completely germane to
yeah,
the Earth as the spinning globe Earth, or is it a spiritual version of interdimensionality, or is it a terrestrial where there's other terrestrial bodies that have their own land masses and domes and organization, and they can somehow infiltrate into ours? And then this is kind of a wild thing, but what about things like the Arctic treaties, that happened under Eisenhower, where
right.
we can't explore the Arctic or especially the
Yeah,
Antarctic and so forth? I mean, I'm trying to like wrap my head around, like, I'm a real brick and mortar guy, you know
yeah,
what I'm saying? So I'm like, I can understand the esoteric stuff pretty well, but like, I'm trying to wrap my head around, is there anything concrete that you're building to, even cosmologically?
yeah. Well, yeah. There's a lot to answer there.
Yeah, it's a
Yes, I
lot,
do
but
deal with all those themes. So one thing I'll say is the book, The Coming World Nation, which is all the things that we're talking about are in that book. The first thing I want to say about that is that there's an aspect of the book that we haven't talked about, which is the introduction and conclusion. So the main body of the book is this historical narrative and presenting this theory that we're talking about. But the introduction and the conclusion, particularly the conclusion of the book, talks about time cycles and the philosophy of time cycles. And one of the interesting things that not many people have really pointed out is that um, we all know about the different ages, right? Like Piscean age, Aquarian age. Now, if you add up all 12 signs, and each one is 2,160 years, that's how these ages are calculated. So each one is a cycle into itself. The Piscean age is a cycle. And the Aquarian age, when that comes, that's its own cycle. But all those together are part of a super cycle, which is called the Great Year. And that's what the name Plato gave to it. But basically, all the religions and philosophies have this discussion about the Great Year. And actually, there is a concrete marker of this 25,000 year plus time cycle, which is all the different zodiac ages combined together. And that's one rotation of the Earth's north celestial pole around its axis. So it makes a 25,000 year gradual circumambulation around a point. which is an esoteric. It doesn't have a fixed marker, but it's called the occult pole. But it's basically the electromagnetic field of the Earth is like it's centered around this pole. And this is a very important marker. This point is very important in esotericism and in the philosophy of astrology. But so that's a 25,000 year cycle. So half of that is 12,000 years about. And if you go 12,000 years ago from where we are today, today we're at this point. This is what the point I make in the introduction and conclusion sections, is that we're at a point when you look at the history, like long-term development of human civilization, which is, I've been studying my whole life. We're going from tribes to, clans, to the first states, to these empires and then nation states. And you can see this development towards world civilization. So we're clearly on the cusp of something that's been long building, thousands and thousands of years, moving towards this integration of humanity. Now that's just politically talking about global government. In terms of psyche and mind and consciousness and culture and values, we're already there with the internet, with Western culture. It's spread worldwide. I mean, you can go to China and find a Starbucks. I remember when I went to China, this is back in high school, in the Forbidden City, there's a Starbucks. That was in 2004. So, so globalization, and in many ways, the connecting tissue is already there. The infrastructure is there. Economically, we're already integrated, So we're at a point that this has clearly been something building towards that we're now on the cusp of. So this is a very significant moment in human history. Also, development of these technologies, which are giving us increasingly godlike, this even without the ether, godlike AI, development of AI and all that stuff. So we are clearly at a major concentration point in the development of the human story. Now, if we go back 1,200 years exactly, we're about 10,000 BC, and that's the date that Plato gives for the sinking of Atlantis, which was a previous global civilization. It was a global empire.
Yeah, which times out perfectly with like Graham Hancock's global cataclysm, which also times out perfectly in like the esoteric Atlantean histories about the fracture of the shield and the flooding from below and above. A lot of them.
So there's this connection. There's a karmic connection that I discuss in the book. There seems to be a relationship now between what we're experiencing today and what happened this half cycle ago. The decline of one thing, then the fragmentation of humanity after that catastrophe, the calamity, the collapse of this empire, which the accounts say had fallen into evil, basically. So the negative karma of Atlantis, I developed this idea in the book, and I reference it kind of throughout. I start talking about it in the introduction, and then I really work on it in the conclusion. But the decline and the demise of Atlantis seems to have created a karmic power or a karmic force within the human soul, within the evolving human spirit, that lingers on and expresses itself within all the subsequent empires that form. There's a little bit of the Atlantean story that plays out again in each, the rise and fall of them. And they always fall in a similar way that the legends, and it wasn't just Plato. I mean, Plato gives us the definitive account, but almost all the ancient myths that Graham Ham talks about is over and over again. There was a great empire. It had a golden age. It fell into evil. It was destroyed by the gods, for its own sins, or it destroyed itself. So there's this whole idea of a karmic relationship between then and now. Well, another thing I bring into in this discussion of time cycles is the idea of in the Hindu philosophy, they have the idea of the Yuga system. And there's this idea that we're now in the Kali Yuga, or the Dark Age. And when it comes to the Yuga system, there's been a lot of disagreement about how you time it. Like, what's the timetable of it? And had a nice synchronicity as I was already going to be writing about this, but I didn't have like some of the firm analysis that I wanted, but it was a major part of the book. And then as I was putting it together, I stumbled upon this work by an author who I interviewed in my podcast. His name is an Indian guy, or a Hindu guy. I don't know if he's Hindu, but he's from India. His name is Bibudev Misra. He's a former engineer, but his passion was to study the Yuga cycle. And he has a different way of dating it, but I really liked his reasoning, and he gives a lot of supportive evidence for it. But his way of dating it is he tries to link it into this idea of the great year. And so there's these 4 subsidiary ages: a golden age, a silver age, a bronze age, and an iron age. And there's a Hindu word that's equivalent, but basically the bronze age, which is like the winter season of this cycle, is called the Kali Yuga. And there's this idea that around 3600 BC, that mankind, or that the earth and mankind by association, entered into this dark age, which is it's not an inherently evil thing, but it's a winter season, which means that this is the time when the material instincts, the ego instincts, become expressed. And it's also, when you get into the philosophy of it, it's an opportunity for development. If you look at the earth as like a developmental, almost like a temple in which souls come in here to evolve, express themselves, learn through experience, reincarnate, obviously. When you come to that idea, it's like there's a purpose behind it. But when you look at the timing of it, it began around 3600 BC, and there's these different power points, because each cycle has its own points of transition. So the quarter points are the big ones, and then obviously the halfway mark is a big one. Like we were talking about with this great year cycle, the halfway mark was Atlantis falling, and now we're coming full circle out of that 1/2 cycle later. But you can look at the different power points of the way these ages have proceeded for over the past 12,000 years, and you can see major points in civilization and major catastrophes aligning with these transition between these ages. So around 3600 BC is when we move into the Kali Yuga. And it's interesting, you can go back and look at these very old documents from like Egypt and before, and there's these kind of dialogues that are recorded where the people are like, well, in this age that's to come, people will fall into materialism, people will live only for wealth, there's like a whole list of things that'll happen that all came true. So it's an archetype that's expressing itself, but it's also creating an experiential environment on Earth for a certain type of person, like maybe someone who lived in Atlantis during the fall, to incarnate into this environment, to experience in a variety of different ways all the things that led to that collapse, so you can eventually come to a point where you, through experience, learn to overcome the problems with human egotism and materiality that led to the problem before. So then you can learn to be a custodian of this power that the Atlanteans apparently abused. So there's this rich symbolism to the story of Atlantis.
I have to pause for an inside joke with Cal. Everything leads back to Benjamin Farley.
Oh gosh, that was the season. Anyhow, as you were.
So that's one thing I should mention, is this whole idea of time cycles becomes very influential in terms of how I analyze all this story. And as I do so, another theme that's throughout the book is this idea, which I take from Jung, which is the idea of the shadow, the collective shadow. And I see this oligarchy that emerged in many ways, and it's very much revealed in the Epstein documents. But it's like that's a concrete manifestation of the shadow within like a concentrated person or group, But each of us has our own shadow tendency. So this idea of the shadow becomes a theme that I developed throughout the book, the fight with the shadow, archetypal. The other thing is I wrote this book and this book on Manly P. Hall, who's been someone I studied for 10 years and is my favorite philosopher. And he, throughout a 70-year career, he wrote dozens of books, like an inhuman amount of material. He wrote dozens of books, hundreds of articles, gave probably thousands of lectures. And it deals with all these types of stuff that we're talking about. And so he lived in the 1900s, and his area of activity was 1920s to 1990. And it's amazing. One of the great mysteries about Manly Hall is that the material that he produced in the 1920s, when he was about 20, 21 years old, is he emerged like fully formed as a philosopher. The work that he did at his earliest, there was no like period of development. He was already seemed like fully knowledgeable and all these things that he would talk about throughout his career. And he was, he was, I think, more appreciated earlier on in his career. He's kind of now become forgotten. And towards the end of his life, when he was much older, he kind of was forgotten. But I mean, he was giving lectures at Carnegie Hall early on. And I mean, he was a very important figure. But I wrote this book, In the Coming World Nation. They actually go side by side or hand in hand, because the book on Manly Hall goes through the whole esoteric history of this period. And in the revised edition, expanded edition I'm doing now, it goes into the whole ideas about Atlantis and stuff like that. And Manly Hall was very much in tune with Blavatsky. So it's like, this is not just one person's creation, but they're really representing a whole tradition that was very much underground, out of sight, other than a small communities of people for a very long time.
Have you ever looked into the work of Rudolf Steiner, who was also a contemporary at this age?
Yeah, he's in that same community. I did look into him a bit, but at a certain point early on, I was like, I kind of, there's so much material to learn. And all these people have a lot of stuff to write, but I also realized that there was, in some areas, some certain incompatibilities that I didn't know how to navigate that space. So I decided once I found Manly Hall, which I just had a intuitive connection to it, and he was helping me make sense of problems that I was really struggling with at the time intellectually, that I was like, I'm just going to focus on him. And he has so much material that it took me 10 years to like go through all of it and to make my kind of outlines of it all and to put all that stuff together to form a book. But he goes through the dissemination of this, what I call in my podcast is called the wisdom tradition. And there's different ways to talk about that, but it's basically this, like, the sacred knowledge of the old priesthoods. And in the telling of Manly Hall and Blavatsky in this field of esoteric philosophy, this knowledge, it wasn't invented in the way we normally think of knowledge. Like, we kind of discover it. Mankind discovers it while he's in the dirt and becomes more civilized. This is a type of knowledge that it's about the law, like the metaphysics, the secret laws of nature. And this was bestowed to man early on from, the hierarchy, the angelic sphere that surrounds our planet, the gods, so to speak. And the pathway by which it is bestowed to man, and it's continually bestowed to anybody who attains that level of psychological insight, illumination, or whatever. I'm not saying I've discovered it, but this is part of the lore of this field of esoteric philosophy. Is that this whole tradition begins on Earth. The receptors of this tradition were the shamans, the medicine men of early tribal society. And then as societies grew into states, so the early days of shaman society, it wasn't just 7,000 years ago. It was millions of years ago. There was the earliest version of it. And so the knowledge about this is bestowed internally through conscious experience, through going out of body, through transcendent meditation and things like that. So that's the origin of where this system of knowledge comes from. And to connect back to one of your questions earlier, the larger ontological framework we're talking about is that, and this idea is something I was well prepared for by studying system science for all those years. System science and a system is about a part-whole relationship. And that's really the fundamental idea of all this philosophy, is that the fundamental thing is unity. That's the first principle. Consciousness is fundamentally a unified entity that moves into and out of conscious expression. So that's what we call God. Analyzed on a more scientific, philosophical basis, it becomes this dynamic concept of consciousness, which is unified, moving into and out of creative expression, like yin and yang. And so when consciousness activates into an active state of expression, it plays host to the universe. What we call creation is that process, but it takes place internally within this great field of unity. And the creation process is one of unity within unity within unity within unity. So the great unity will create, a panoply of lesser unities, and each of those in turn plays host to its own. So in Buddhism, it's Buddha within Buddha, and then there's this one supreme Buddha. So it's the same idea. So the unity or the God or the Buddha of the world that we inhabit is the solar system. Not just the physical sun in the sky, but the solar system. And that's in turn within a larger, like, galactic Buddha. And so there's this whole hierarchy that happens. But we interface with all these greater mysteries through the sun, the solar spirit. And the planets are basically the organ systems of this great being, which is expressing itself through its own consciousness is expressing itself through these planetary systems. So Earth, our planet, is obviously one of these systems, but the fundamental relationship of the solar system, the different parts to this whole that contains it, is the basis of astrology and astrological philosophy, and why it works. Is because you're not just when we look at the solar system, when we look at space, we're seeing it through not only the lens of our own eyes and our own minds, which interpret it a certain way, but also the lens of the Earth itself. So the Earth itself is seen as alive. It's its own developing future sun, along with all the other ones, the planets. And our sun is part of has sister suns that go along with it, and they're part of a larger unity. That's in part of a large. So that's the basic framework. But studying system science doesn't get into this metaphysics and esoteric stuff. But the system science thing, what's so revolutionary about it, is that every field of science has its own branch of system science in which you can describe that field as part-whole relationships. Whether you're talking about a biological organism, an economic system, etc. Like every chemistry, atoms, everything can be described in this way because there's one archetypal pattern that is expressing itself throughout the entirety of creation in all these different ways.
So Cal and I are old jocks and we pretend to be intellectuals, but we probably tap out at about 2 hours. So bring us home with like where your research is leading. And it sounds like you have a fundamental optimism. So like, as we kind of wrap the podcast up, like just, you have children.
Yeah.
Are you fundamentally optimistic about the world that we're kind of evolving into? Like, let's, some sense of summation here.
Well, let's bring back things back to the idea of the Kali Yuga, but the timing of that, because in that timetable, we're now at this point of moving out of it. So we're at this like great point of like fundamental transformation. And that may or may not include great calamities, but the archetype, I think I see things again as archetypes. So archetypally, we're now moving into a new phase of the cycle. We're moving out of the winter season. We're moving back in towards a spring season. All the experiences that we learned through this 1,000 years plus cycle are being harvested now. But it's also the end of the cycle is a time of great concentration. So I talk about this in the book, the archetype of Atlantis, which is the archetype of empire, and the mentality behind it, the psychology of it, is manifesting itself in a very intense way. And it manifests very harshly through each individual psyche through the shadow. It's a time of shadow complexes, the surfacing of the shadow, individually and collectively. And so when I look out in society, or even look at my son's life or my family's life or my own life, I see that dynamic taking place. It's the shadow tendencies that are gripping us and forcing us to deal with things that we may have repressed for lifetimes, in the past. So this is a time of great trial and testing, is what I look at it. So I am optimistic, but I am also realistic in the sense that this is a time where we will likely be confronted with many things that are very challenging. But I also believe in reincarnation. I believe in the spirit of the soul. So that's certainly a source of, like, you can never be doom and gloom and a nihilist in the face of terrible things if you have that foundation, because everything that you do in this life carries on with you, with the resonance of it, and will express itself in the future, and you take it with you into the afterlife. So all those things are very much informed by how I look at things. But the specific things I'm working towards now, so I have this one book manuscript that I'm writing, and these two books will go together. But I have my new venture is this nonprofit that I'm starting. It's called Solomon's House, which is a reference to something we won't be able time to get into, but this figure of Francis Bacon is very important. He wrote a short story towards the end of his life. Francis Bacon is basically the godfather of many things, including the scientific age. He was also the headmaster of a society of poets who wrote the Shakespeare plays and a number of other important works that are foundational to the rise of modern Western civilization and the development of the psyche of the West. He also was the mastermind behind the American colonization scheme. And he was also the one, he didn't found Masonry because Masonry is a very old thing, but the modern version of what's called speculative masonry, which is detached from the building trade. It used to be the masonry was around the temple builders or the cathedral builders. They had their own like society, and that was and their own rituals and practices, and that was the basic foundation of masonry. But Francis Bacon created what's called speculative masonry and invited in other outside members, and so he basically created a transcontinental network in America. It would move into America from the very, very beginning, but it would also become, the tendrils of it would start to connect England and Germany at this very deep level. And those, like 100, 150 years after Francis Bacon's death, those would be activated and would basically coordinate the American Revolution. So he wrote a short story called The New Atlantis, and in it, he envisioned, is a utopian novel. So it's part of a series of utopian works that came. It was really the last in the line of these great utopian novels of that early Middle Ages period, 1500s, 1600s. And in his depiction of this ideal society, it was centered around a college of philosophy, and it was delving into the sciences. It was like, we want to perfect our understanding of the sciences and the development of useful resources for the betterment of mankind and the elevation of mankind. And so this philosophic university was called Solomon's House in the book. So I have this nonprofit that's called Solomon's House, and the point of it is to, in many different ways, try to instigate a philosophical renaissance, because that's what I think our society desperately needs. Is like everything we've been discussing about can be put under the umbrella of this perspective of philosophy. And we're at a time period where philosophy basically is nothing in our society. It doesn't mean anything. And most times people associate it with just intellectualism. Like it can be any idea that you want it to be, you can call it philosophy. But the word itself actually comes from Pythagoras. And Pythagoras was a fundamental figure, one of the most important figures in world history, but he's the one who coined the term philosophy. And he had a specific set of a specific worldview, a specific set of teachings. He had an intention behind the word. And if we can go back and discover what that original intention was, that'll give us the idealism. It'll give us the foundation of principles and ideas that we can build on to create a social movement, an intellectual movement, a political movement. All these things philosophy can move into and bring all these people. There's a lot of people who I see, including y'all's work and Alec's work, and many other people who I think can be brought under this umbrella of philosophy, and everybody can sort of be linked together, whereas now everybody's doing kind of a separate thing. But we need a renaissance desperately. And so it's my next mission in life, after moving beyond this writing stage that I've been in for like the past 5 years, is to try to headmaster this nonprofit. And so that's the goal. I have an idea. We'll talk after the podcast about an event or two in Austin I'd like to do. But I mean, in practical terms, I would like to make it like a think tank, like a philosophy-based think tank that's moving into the various areas of the world crises, but bringing this perspective and level of analysis to it, and trying to bring lots of different stakeholders together who work in different areas that are relevant to whatever crisis we're talking about, and get them moving in coordination with a sense of idealism behind it. So yeah, but to as I work towards that goal, in the beginning, I like to do just small conferences, workshops, little documentaries, stuff like that. So I think Austin would be a great place to get things started.
I have an idea where we could host one.
Yeah.
And we could help seed the group with, I mean, there's a number of men in our men's group. You mentioned Alec and Luke Story, who you're going on his podcast, and you know, a few other guys that would really resonate. And, Aubrey, Kyle. But yeah, dude, this has been amazing. It's kind of everything I wanted it to be, just really enlightening for me. So much stuff that I've kind of scratched the surface, been down the YouTube videos, read some here and there, certainly listened to the chef here talk about a lot of this stuff, but to have someone that's done such deep research and stayed true to certain principles, like I really appreciate that. I look forward to getting into the book. I love and resonate with your view of where we are now, and just holding that there's like this idea of faith, and you know, there is shadow and it's there, you know, for our greater good. I think we can all say we're recognizing that in the world right now, not only on a global scale, but just individually and amongst the people that we're around, and it has been really challenging, and we're seeing the fruits of that already. And to your point, doesn't mean there's not more calamity to come. There probably is, but I feel like I have a good orientation to that just through my own experience, and appreciate that the title, the subtitle in particular, why global government is inevitable, completely gave me a different perspective on that, because that was a lot of doom and gloom for me up until today. So thank you for that.
Well, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed this.
Great. Yeah. I mean, you're a deep and prodigious and original thinker. So I look forward to following you for years to come.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Cal. That was great.
Thanks,
Thank
Jeff.
you, Alex.
Cheers.
Yeah. Thanks, brother.